Are you or your clients looking for a regular income solution with compelling returns to diversify your portfolio? If so, Neighborhood Holdings may be a great option for you. Listeners of this podcast will appreciate that public markets can be turbulent and finding a good private credit fund can be tough. But Neighborhood's track record, transparency, and investor alignment sets it apart from the pack. With nearly 10 years of consistent performance and a target net yield of 8 to 10%, Neighborhood has a track record of providing monthly income to investors without the volatility of public markets. How do they do this? Where banks invest in mortgages up to 95% loan to value, they also make borrowers jump through a lot of hoops. Many borrowers in transition aren't able to meet those hoops. Neighborhood has partnered with banks and brokers to provide quality borrowers with temporary financing secured by first mortgages at an average loan to value of less than 60%. Where other mortgage funds might take more risk by lending against construction, bare land, or jumbo loans, Neighborhood is focused on your average residential borrower who owns the average house in the neighborhood. Plus, their variable rate with a floor mortgage pricing benefits investors when interest rates go up and mitigates downside risk. Check out the link in the description or visit neighborhoodholdings.com to view the offering memorandum or speak to your financial advisor for more information. That's neighborhoodholdings.com/Loonie Hour. Before we get started, I just want to remind everyone that this information discussed today is not intended to be or construed as investment advice. Please consult a professional advisor before putting a loonie in any of these financial markets.
The dirty secret is that no one's ever going to get paid back.
People have the shortest memories when it comes to investment.
We just got to get Keith into Bitcoin.
Hey, there's a bubble.
Welcome back to the Loonie Hour, episode 172. As always, joined by the three amigos, Boomer, Keith Dicker, Ice Cap, Asset Management, Rich Diaz, back of the art wall.
Back in the art wall, back home, heavier, a little tired from the skiing and then drinking with my wonderful, wonderful Icelandic friends, but back in Montreal. And it's snowing and absolutely freezing yesterday.
The Habs are still hot.
Dude, we're going to win the cup. Sassana Cup. We're going to win the cup. I can feel it. I can feel it. You heard it here first, folks.
Well, as good of a chance as the Canucks. They stink. Keith, what's going on with the Mooseheads?
I don't know. I'm back in my office. I had my fun shirt on last week. Today, I have my serious shirt on because we have some serious conversations to have this week.
Right.
This will be the first ever serious Loonie Hour.
No jokes.
Should save that shirt for next week. You're going to reuse it when we interview Danielle.
Actually, I'm just messing with everyone. This won't be a serious episode. It'll be the same as everyone. I should wear this one next week for the...
Yeah, wear that one.
Okay.
Going to reuse it. It'll be pit stains all over it and everything.
So, this is a Twinkie Bet episode, right? Because we have the BOC next week. Why don't we just start with that? Let's do it now. Or are we going to, slow walk it?
No. We got to get into CPI inflation, everything that's going on in that market. So, Rich, why don't we kick it off with CPI headline inflation and we'll kind of segue. But I don't know. I don't know how many Canadians these days are really I remember when we had the Loonie Hour early days where it was like every month we're like, okay, what's inflation going to come in at? And I feel like it's kind of fading, like the excitement around it, but maybe we'll get back there. So headline inflation, Rich, came in at 1.8% year over year, down from 1.9 a month earlier.
Yep.
Obviously, a bunch of that is from the GST, the ill-conceived GST holiday that brought, I guess, prices down temporarily. So I don't know how you unpack this, but what your takeaway was. I mean, I've got some very loose thoughts just looking at the data, but I mean, I don't know. It's just, I guess it hasn't really been that exciting in Canada. I think the US number is way more important, but
it is more important. You're 100% right. It is a bit boring. You're right to point that out, but let's just go quickly through it. And then I'll get to something really exciting, which is what I think is going to happen next. And so, yes, you're right. So all the components. So everything other than shelter, your favorite services, which is dominated by shelter and rent, and transportation basically fell. So clothing fell 3.3%, alcoholic down 2.4%. This is all month on month, by the way. Food down 1.8%. It was all related to the GST holiday. I think it's, in a way, it's important to talk about it in a sense. However, we need to look past this data, so we're not going to spend too much time on it. But I think one thing I thought was interesting was that the core. So remember our favorite, the BOC measures, BOC preferred measures of core inflation, they all sort of track down. And the reason that's important is because they exclude the outliers. So even the GST holiday issues will be less pronounced, less obvious in those core measures, and they're sort of back down to target. Just one more thing I thought was interesting was that crude oil prices continue to rise. And actually, if I'm not mistaken, I think the energy stocks are some of the best performing stocks year to date. So out of the gate, that they're the best. And what we're seeing is CPI energy, that component is starting to rise in lockstep, which makes sense. And then the thing that I think is really exciting is our ICE cap inflation model, which is based on producer prices or core producer prices, so excluding the effects of energy, is now starting to go higher and higher, and is predicting that core inflation hits 2.8 by the sort of end of this summer, which will make it very, very interesting for the BOC. And to impress my boss, Keith, I invented a new inflation ICE cap model based on raw materials prices, which are particularly sensitive to the decline in the Canadian dollar. And that's sort of reiterating what I'm seeing from producer prices more generally, which is that inflation's really bottomed. And I think going forward, I think we should be looking out for higher inflation. So there you go. That's my piece on inflation. Keith, are you impressed?
I think, Rich, you had me on just as soon as you said inflation, you had me anyway. So it's good. Like Steve, you mentioned like the number was 1.8, and I automatically just go to the core number, which is Rich mentioned, it's a bit higher, is like 2.4 or 2.5, but it also trended lower from the previous month and is in line. But we always talked about, what is the new 2%? What's the floor? So what Rich is suggesting is that, hey, maybe we've already hit the floor, and some of the data is suggesting that we go higher here into the summer, and that's going to have a big potential impact with the guy that's I think last week we called him a squirmer. Remember that, Steve?
Yeah, the squirmer.
We think he squirms in the seat. He's a squirm. And I think he's going to have this moment coming up where he's going to be squirming a lot because, as Rich is telling us, the inflation data could be pretty darn sticky, yet the economy, could be, kind of loose and going in the wrong direction. And then, Steve, there's a decision to be made.
I've got some thoughts that might help our buddy Tiff. And Rich, we're going to continue to debate this, but so on the CPI on the CPI inflation metric, 30% of the growth, so I think it was 1.8%, 30% of that year-over-year growth was from the shelter component.
Yeah.
Sorry, not from the shelter, from the mortgage interest component.
Okay.
Which it's crazy. I mean, that's still feeding through. Obviously, that base effect, I suppose, is going to come out over time. But the rent component as well, Rich, is at 7.1% year over year. I want to add to this is everything that I'm seeing on the ground is the rental market is like it's not good. I shouldn't say it's not good. It's soft. So if you're a prospective tenant, it's very good. The vacancy rate is moving higher. Rents are down, honestly, over the last year and a bit, 10% is like an easy number. Certain markets, like if you have like a bad product, like, I don't know, unrenovated garden suite, like, you're probably down 15%. So like the rental market is really soft. And like, particularly in the Vancouver and GTA, I mean, like markets like Alberta are still strong, but I think they're starting to come off. I think where this gets really interesting, and this is like more big picture over the next 12 to 24 months, is the only good thing that the Liberal government ever did for housing was they tweaked the CMHC construction financing for rental developments, and they made that very favorable. And so what you've seen is the private sector, of course, if they can get favorable loans, is they started building a lot of rental buildings. And so a lot of those rentals are under construction. In fact, you have a record number of units that are under construction in the rental market. So these are not going to be sold. These are not sold to pre-sale investors. These are just purpose-built
rentals. So one, maybe it's a REIT, maybe it's a large private sector, maybe it's just a bunch of people pooling their capital together, but basically they're constructing rental buildings, rental units, and there's a record number of those that are in the pipeline that are going to be completing over the next 24 months at a time when I just told you rents are down 10%, and we know that population growth is going to basically zero. So that rental market is going to be interesting. And so I think that 7.1 number is going to go from 7.1 year over year to negative, whatever, 3, 4, 5. I don't know where it goes, but like in real time, it's negative.
Yeah, I mean, that is where you and I are going to fight over and over again. And I think it'll be really interesting over the summer. I think Keith is going to have to separate us, because I think what it's about is, I think, because obviously the data is, I'm looking at the chart right now and I can't disagree. The rental component of the CPI just track population growth. Population growth is falling. We can share that chart. But the thing for me is raw materials and sort of the input costs from across the board, and the negative effects of the currency. And so it'll be see which one of these two wins. I mean,
it's gonna be fascinating. I will say this. So like on the it's gonna get interesting on the CMHC rental component. So what's been happening is, like, I think CMHC now kind of behind the scenes is starting to tighten guidelines, because they're like, oh shit, like we put a lot of we funneled a lot of taxpayer dollars out into this sector, and like declining rents don't help the pro forma. Like the pro forma was built on like, $3,000 a month for, the units, and now they're trading at 28. Like that changes the math a lot. So they're starting to, similar to TIFF, they're starting to squirm a little bit over there. And it's going to be interesting to see how this all shakes out. So there's still a lot going on. And then you look at the individual operator, the guy that bought, a 1-bedroom pre-sale condo that's going to be competing on the rental market with these large institutional type of operators. And there's going to be a squeeze. So I think that those parts of the market, I don't think are getting better anytime soon.
And that brings us to, before we get to the Twinkie bet, that brings me to the chart that I shared, and I'll put it in the chat so we can share it together, which is the yield curve basically saying that the cuts are done, that we have basically one more cut next week, and that we have one more cut, and that after that it's over, basically, that there's basically no more cuts in the yield curve. And so that's really interesting. I don't know how that's going to shake out with the fight between your point, which is the declining in rents, and my point, which is everything else I think is going to start creeping higher, is what I think is affecting the yield curve and the bond market. And so right now we're seeing at the front end of the yield curve, sort of the short-term bonds are only pricing 17 basis points. And we're going to talk about what we think that means. But if you look further out, the 2-year bond yield is basically sort of flat on it. So basically that's it. So we're done basically with respect to cuts. If you look at the yield curve, of course, this can change with anything with respect to tariffs or I don't know, recession talk, whatever. But I think it is interesting that that's what's going on right now in the bond yield curve, excuse me.
Yeah, I think there's there's a whole host of, predictions out there. It's funny. Like I think I posted this on Twitter maybe a week and a half, 2 weeks ago, where the big 5 Canadian banks put out like all their forecasts for where they see, the 5-year bond yield and the overnight rate by the end of 2025. And like the predictions were all over the place. You had, RBC calling for like 125 basis points of cuts still. And then you had Scotiabank, Derek Holt, who's calling for, one and done, similar to what you're saying here now. So, yeah, I guess we'll find out.
So let's liven this up a bit, because that was a, for a nerd fight, you guys saying you're going to fight about this, that was a snoozer, guys. No one is showing up in the school playground to watch this one go down.
Well, hey, man, I think it's important. I mean, in the mortgage world, I think we're seeing about 40% of the market right now is going variable mortgages. So there's a lot.
But let's bring it over to a different
aggressive cut still.
Yeah, I know, but in a few months, myself and Bob Sacamano will sit back and watch you guys do this. And but let's go. I like what you suggested, Steve. And what I'm hearing from you, and tell me if I'm right or wrong with it, that the housing market and specifically the rental market could deteriorate even further, which will drag inflation data down a lot lower. And it's going to be a lot. And obviously, what Rich is seeing is that the data could go the opposite direction. So let's go down this scenario where, Steve, you are correct, and the economy rolls lower as well. And then all of a sudden, all of these Bay Street estimates for one cut and done. Where are we right now? We're at 3.25 next week. We'll get to where that's going to be in a few minutes. But in your scenario, Steve, we could go down go from 3.25 down to 2.75, 2.25, maybe something like that.
Yeah. I just had like a guy reached out to us, prospective client, and he was like, I had this, professional property manager, and I knew the property manager, and so I said, oh well, what did you. He's like, I've been trying to rent this thing out for 3 months and just no bites, so I guess I'm just gonna sell it. Like, can you come sell it? And so I talked to the property manager. I was like, oh, just out of curiosity, what did you have this thing rented for? I mean, what did you have it up for? And he said, well, we put it on at 28, no bites, like crickets, dropped it to 27, crickets, dropped it to 26, crickets. And like, man, like, is it for a 2-bedroom unit just outside in the burbs? But I was like, that seems pretty low, 2,600 compared to what we're used to. And I said to him, I was like, what would that rent for kind of the peak rental market? And he's like, oh, 3,000 easy. Right. So like, it's a unit that needed a bit of love inside, but going from $3,000 to now we're at 2,600 crickets. It's not good. That's a tough market. I mean, so it's gonna be a fight to quality. It's like the nicer, newer units, are gonna perform probably just fine, but it's all the other stuff that's sort of second and third tier where it's just sitting. And people in Vancouver are not used to that.
No.
Like falling
house
rents
prices always go up, Steve.
Falling rents in Vancouver is not a thing. Like that does not compute. Like I'm familiar with the Alberta market as well, and people there are very, very much used to rents declining, and having to give free internet for a year and all these little tidbits. But like in Vancouver, like that does not compute. So there's gonna be
so is that a one-off then? Is that a unique narrative that you just share, or is it increasingly more prevalent, across?
I think it's increasingly more prevalent. I'll give you an example. Like if you're in like prime, let's say downtown core, 1-bedroom, maybe near the top of the rental market was, let's call it $2,800 a month. Like if that vacancy comes up now and you got to fill that vacancy, like you're not getting 28, you're probably, I don't know, 2,650. But like, and it's not renting in a week like it used to. It might take you 4 to 6 weeks to find a tenant. So like, I mean, it's an adjustment.
Folks, we're in a recession. This is what happens in a recession. I mean, the unemployment rate in Toronto is 10%. In Canada, it's rising. Vancouver, it's rising. Those are the only 3 jurisdictions I know, because that's what the National Bank published in their cool little monthly chart pack. I think we're going to see more and more of this, which of course is contradicting my other point about, I think, inflation going up, but we'll see. Anyways, Keith's bored, so let's make a bet about that.
Well, so in my Bermuda days, that's a few years back, a cheap rent was $8,000 a month.
Jeez.
That was a slump.
Yikes.
So yeah, that's what that was. Anyway, that's just a funny add-on. Maybe not. Are we ready now then so we've established that, inflation data is getting a bit weaker. Steve is suggesting it can get even weaker. Rich is suggesting, no way, man, it's actually bottomed or troughed, and that's going to go higher. And I've said absolutely nothing to support either side at this point. But Steve, you're up first then with the Bank of the bet. What do you have them down
I think
for next week?
25 basis points, shoe in, easy. Yeah.
So he's not even squirming over this one then. It's just like he turns on his computer and hits one button and it's done.
I think it's more interesting. It'll be more interesting, sort of the narrative or the language that he uses in his press conference. Is he get more hawkish and say, hey, it's 25 and we're thinking we're close to the end? Like I'm kind of curious from that perspective. I think
maybe he can use profanity, slam the desk a few times, liven it up. And okay, 20, so Steve is down for 25, a cut, that is correct.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, Rich seems like he's in for a hike. Is that what you're saying?
No, no. The
100
last
basis
time I
point
said that, I
hike.
got in trouble with you guys. So no, I'll go for 25 basis points cut. Also, Steve's right. It's really the next meeting that I think will get really interesting because there's going to be the tariff stuff. We'll get some visibility on GST stuff. Yeah. So
Yeah,
in for
I'm also
25.
down for a quarter point cut.
Ah, boo.
I think it's coming up afterwards where it could get a bit more interesting. But the narrative that we talked a little about it last week, I think, or the week before, but the whole conversation about the new administration in the US and they could be changing tariffs with Canada, stuff like that. Canadians are in Ottawa, including in the Bank of Canada. They seem to be quite rational in the conversation about it. Actually,
Wait,
no,
what?
I meant irrational, to be honest.
I
So
almost believed you for a second.
yeah, no, I think the squirmer is really squirming over this, and that would lead to even more cuts, coming up. So I think 25 is in the bag for this week. So when they have their presser at the end, and I don't know if they're having a presser next week. Every now and then they don't have one, by the way. It's just a statement. So I don't know what they're doing next week. But if it is, maybe we can play the drinking game. How many times do they mention, Trump and
Tariffs.
tariff it? Yeah, and all that stuff. So I think that's a bit of a wild card that would even support even further cuts. And because Steve, you did present the scenario where the Bank of Canada could become even more dovish, and I'm leaning in your camp, Steve. I think the Bank of Canada can be a lot more aggressive with cutting because of what's on the horizon coming
Well,
up.
yeah.
That's what.
Listen, everyone's gonna say, "Oh, the Canadian dollar," and it's like, yeah, I mean, the Canadian dollar is. I'd be surprised if it didn't go lower. I mean, it's been the release valve from day one, and yeah, like it sucks. Like it's I can't make it's hard to make a bullish argument today for the Canadian dollar, but maybe that's maybe that's a good indication that sentiment's about as bad as it can be.
But that's what's so interesting about the yield curve, because the bond market, is not totally dumb, right? And the fact that there's basically that it's not pricing anything other than a cut or two over the next 12, 18 months, I think is a really, really interesting.
But if the curve is
wrinkle.
flattened,
Yeah,
right? So the short end is staying where and the long end is coming down, like to be simple about it with the
Yeah.
flattening. That's suggesting a recession, continuous slowdown in the economy, which then by default, and depending on how the numbers work out, but could cause Bank of Canada to cut even more. I think the
I guess.
squirmers set up to cut even more, guys. It's gonna be cut,
Man.
baby,
It really,
cut. That's
it
where
actually
we're headed.
offends me to hear you say the word squirm. I don't know why.
We gotta get Bob Sakamoto back on the show. Sakamoto.
Sacramento.
Anyways.
Okay, cool. So we're so basically no one's eating a Twinkie next week unless you just want to eat a Twinkie, right? That's the
Thank
deal.
goodness. No.
Yeah. Hey, but
Okay,
there's
cool.
a lot of things that are shifting and changing. Obviously, Trump is officially back in the White House, and Rich, I think what's been the most fascinating of all this, and trying to be high level and as objective as possible, is just to see the politics shifting at every level, like not just Canada, the U.S., globally. Like everyone's just, oh yeah, okay, we're like I don't know, just to see like the 180 like Zuckerberg is pulled, going on Rogan and being like, yeah, Biden tried to silence us, and like yeah, it's just crazy to see everyone changing, and we've got everyone fleeing the Mark Carney Net Zero Bankers Alliance.
Ah, yes, my favorite thing.
Yeah, like I don't know if you want to talk to it, elaborate on that. We had another Canadian bank or two pull out just this past week.
Yeah, a bunch now. I think we're almost at the, what is it called? A full house or a five of a kind, something like some kind of a garbled poker analogy. But yeah,
Who's
so let's
left?
just quick. Sorry, who left?
RBC?
Yeah, well, I mean, I have it in front of me. So, so TD, BMO, National Bank, Canadian Imperial Bank of Commerce. I mean, it's four
The
of a
hell's
kind.
RBC doing?
Yeah, I mean, don't worry, they're next.
So are they all out, or is it just RBC left?
I don't want to screw this up.
Well, JP Morgan's out.
Yeah. Well, in the US, it's over. JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs.
But Rich, explain for everyone what this means,
Sure.
what this net zero
Sure.
banking, and again, how they can lend money and change.
Sure. So our dear leader's best friend, Mark Carney, had this great idea to start something called the Net Zero Banking Alliance. And it's a global coalition of banks basically aligning their investment portfolios to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2025. Now, that's a fancy way of saying what they wanted to do is they wanted to strangle or cut the pipe of capital and credit to the fossil fuel industry. This is outside of the regular sort of jurisdictional or legislative process. And what it was a bunch of banks, they pledged to transition their financing, so loans and investment, away from the fossil fuel industry and towards renewable energy sector, basically away from energy intensive transportation and real estate industries that are very, very highly they produce a lot of emissions, and towards anything that doesn't, except China, of course, because they kept lending to China. But anyway, I digress. And so it's and it was also, I mean, they talk about a lot about transparency and accountability, but in my view, this is the total opposite of that. This is a lot of backroom dealings. This is outside the normal democratic and legislative process. And anyway, so this is basically one of the United Nations sort of programs. And what we're seeing, as I thankfully predicted, which was that it would all sort of fall apart when it became very obvious that the stated aim was not only unethical in my view, but just unachievable via the way they're talking about. And we're also just seeing fundamentally the zeitgeist shift, which is, I don't think I think Trump is sort of the final nail in the coffin. I think it was already starting to happen because of things like the invasion of Ukraine and sending natural gas prices to the moon. But also fundamentally, it's bullshit. China, still produces something like more than all China's emissions are bigger than all of the Western world combined, even if you account for the differences in production versus consumption of energy, which is always the sort of always the argument that people have whenever I bring up China. And so it's really, really interesting, and it's sort of all falling apart. And we're just seeing, and what we're seeing in Canada is just an extension of what we've seen for the last 6 months or so.
Yeah, right. So we've had Mark Carney recently, who's come out, and of course Chrystia Freeland have both said, okay, well, if you elect us as the Liberal Party next PM, we will not have a carbon tax, or at least Mark Carney's, basically is going to rebrand it. So it's just become so politically unpopular that they're like, well, we wouldn't support that, of course. So it's just interesting to see like the politics around it, right? I mean, it's shifting. The pendulum swung so far in one direction. It's now swinging back. And again, everyone is entitled to their own political views and what they believe is right and wrong. But I think the point we're trying to make is that politically and geopolitically, the pendulum is swinging. So what does this mean for markets, in particular, our finances? It's significant, and I think it's so obvious how much the pendulum is swinging back in the other direction.
And this is where the opportunity is for Canada, coming up. And I think we've been our observations on which trend that the country is heading. I think we've been dead on with that. But now with the pendulum, it has it's changed direction. It's going in the other direction now. And with our natural resource and energy base, and now with the change from policies, and by the way, Mark Carney, I think people know now, I've stated my views. I do not agree with a lot of his views on things. He is the ultimate globalist, by the way. And another change in the pendulum, you have the World Economic Forum taking place this week and over in Davos, Switzerland. And even that is now trending lower. Hardly anyone is going
Keith,
there anymore.
The most dangerous man in Canada on the show, Stephen Guilbeault.
Not a friend of the show.
Not a friend of the show. is publicly come out and endorse Carney. So I think it just tells you what you need to know. I think that Carney intellectually is an incredibly intelligent human being. But I also think fairly dangerous. I mean, I think that him and Gilbo are one and one of the same.
But and again, like, everyone in our world, everyone is smart, right? Everyone is able to do different things. He's had a lot of
Like,
success where he went. But this push where the whole West has gone, which include the Americans
yeah,
and the Canadians and all of Europe and Japan and especially Australia, those guys are just wacky. And then New Zealand's even more wacky, if you can believe it. All that is now coming to an end. And what that means now that, like, the sun has come up and there's this incredible opportunity for the energy and commodity resource sector, which is, we have a lot of it here in Canada. So I think if our policymakers align themselves with the Americans, I can see a weekend. And again, I'm not joking to say this. One weekend, let me do what needs to be done in Canada with our fiscal side, and the Canadian dollar. You
oh
go to
no,
bed
here
on
come the flood of emails.
Yeah, the Canadian dollar, you go to bed on Friday, it's at 68, 69 cents or whatever it is. And on Monday morning, it's going to be at like $1.50. Like, this is an amazing opportunity, and we just need to get there. And it's right in
Wait,
front of us.
What I meant
That's
to
it.
say though
wait.
was
Go
Carney
ahead.
would have been like the perfect PM, like 3, 4, 5 years ago, when politically, geopolitically, that was like in favor. Like, he's kind of like, he's almost like going against the grain. Like, he's just like,
Yeah.
he's just the wrong person at the wrong time. You know what
I
I
mean,
mean? Like, it's like, I don't know. Just look at, like, Rich, we've talked about, like, one of the core themes on the Loonie Hour has been like Germany, right? Like, the people that are running that country, like, let's be honest, I think they must be, they have to be smart people. I think they're just blinded by ideology that they've self-imposed. They've basically, self-destructed on horrible energy policy. And you can't tell me it's because they're dumb people. I think they're
well, I mean,
smart people that
Misguided.
just view the world. They're just
well,
misguided.
I mean, they obviously
There you
just
go.
don't know how to use the internet. And I think what's important is, I think we just, I mean, just stepping away from Carney's sort of ideological capture, which I think is fundamental, is important. I think fundamentally we keep forgetting sort of the elephant in the room, and that's China. And that for all of the propaganda about their energy transition, because I don't know how else to describe it. It is a fundament. That is what it boils down to. That the entire West has not increased their carbon emissions in 20 years. And so, and the fact that, and the data is very, very clear on this. Just go to Our World in Data. You can just Google it and you can see all of Europe peaked in 1980, let's say 1985, and is way down. Even on a GDP on a per capita basis, I think Europe is at like a 60-year low. The UK is at almost a 100-year low. Meanwhile, China continues to build coal power plants in space. I don't want to dwell too much on it. China, India, and God, all more power to them. I'm not being critical of that decision. What I'm critical of in the West, us self-flagellation, the sort of ritual suicide. Meanwhile, the biggest emitter of global greenhouse gases not only continues on their path, is accelerating, is doubling down on how we got there. And so I think that's, that was the problem with Mark Carney and the rest of that cabal, is that for all of their good intentions, they just, like, for some reason, they're blinded by what's going on in one of the largest, most important economic zones in the world, which is China, and then throw on India on top of that. And so until those two things get squared, you could wipe Canada off the face of the earth, 1.5 whatever percent of global emission, and it would not make a difference. There's 982 new coal-fired power plants being built in Asia alone right now.
So, Rich, Trump, in his inauguration speech there, pulled out of the Paris Accord, and he said, quote, "The United States will not sabotage our own industries while China pollutes with impunity." So again, I think that you can very much disagree or dislike him as a person, as a politician, but I mean, I don't think fundamentally he's wrong there.
He's not. He's not. The data is very clear. China 60%. Anyway, I don't want to go on and on about this. We have so much more to talk about, but just like China's coal, out of all of China's electricity production right now, China is 60% coal, and that hasn't changed despite all of the bullshit about renewables. All right. So anyway,
remember coal usage is hit a record high in 2024.
Yeah, that's right.
Coal usage is right. And then it's funny because you remember the president of India, Modi. He was out tweeting on Twitter, like, I don't know, 2, 3, 4 months ago, talking about that India had record coal usage and that he was very proud of the achievement. Basically powering India into like the new age,
of course,
securing stable energy, and so India
into the 19th century. I think that's what he said.
But but they're like for the country, obviously that's continuing to develop. I mean, they're happy that they're
of course they are,
more
and
people
more
out of
power to
poverty.
them. Listen, Indonesia is also doing it. Indonesia has huge nickel resources, right? As a stupid example. And in order to process, smelt, and refine nickel, you need a lot of baseload energy. Guess who is like who's doubled down on coal? Indonesia, one of the largest Muslim countries in the world, one of the largest countries in the world, full stop, right? So we've got 300 million people sitting there wanting jobs, wanting money, and wanting to develop. And how are they doing that? They're doing
And where
are
they getting? Forgive me, my question are they getting a lot of that from Australia, or do
they have a lot of
the?
Funnily enough, they actually have a lot of coal reserves themselves. So they are importing. Australia is one of the largest coal exporters in the world. A lot of their coal goes to China. A ban a couple of years ago. But anyway, and nevertheless, but Indonesia has huge coal reserves themselves, and that's the thing about coal. It's easy to get. It's abundant. It's safe. Blah 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 blah. I have lots of videos on this.
But you also need. I mean, if you want to create the heat necessary to create steel, you can't do it through clean energy. Maybe I'm wrong by saying that.
You can. There's no. Wait a second. You can nuclear power.
Okay. Let's next move. So we did that. I think, Steve, you've kind of touched on the irony. This is the last Canadian, political comment for today.
Well, yeah. Okay. So again, the pendulum is clearly swung. It is what it is. You can blame the orange guy. You can blame I think what happens is you get into a point of the world where we are today, where we are no longer in peace times. People are, it's becoming about nationalism, more closed borders. It's becoming about cost of living. People are just looking out for themselves now, right? When you're thinking about whether or not you can afford to put food on the table or fill up the gas in your car, people stop caring about all the other dumb crap that we've been, spoon-fed over the last 4 or 5 years. Is people just start saying, what about me? And so, we're seeing, right, the tides are turning against, like open border policy, rampant immigration. And so it's just the pendulum swinging back. Obviously, with Trump coming in, that this has exacerbated that pendulum swinging in that direction. For example, he's talking about lowering taxes, deregulating. So now we've got, Chrystia Freeland, who's again running for the next Prime Minister of Canada, who, as finance minister, was introduced the higher capital gains inclusion rate out this week, saying, if you elect me, I'll get rid of it. So like 4 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago was like the best idea. All of a sudden she's like, nah, it's not a good idea. I'm getting rid of it. Like, what changed?
I'll tell you what changed. Her opportunity to become prime minister. That's what's changed.
Opportunity to become prime minister for sure. And obviously, again, I think reading the writing on the wall, which is like, listen, like you're going to have to remain competitive somehow. And things have changed. So the world has changed dramatically.
So we all know this. Our listeners all know this, except for a couple who are critical, and that's fine. Let's next talk about.
Wait a second.
No.
Go ahead, Steve. I want to get my
we've got a few more
this.
things on that. Like, if you want to chime in on that particular point, but just there's so many things that are changing right now. So the U.S. has also withdrawn from the OECD global tax deal.
Big deal.
So you remember, if you're a staunch listener of the Loonie Hour, we had Professor Michael Geist on the show when there was all these bills that were coming in Canada about a digital services tax. If you're wondering why, when you go on Instagram, you can't read a whole bunch of news feeds on Instagram anymore, it's because of this digital services tax and all this other crap that they were fighting with Facebook and Google about. And so, but the US pulling out of the OECD global tax deal, it's probably going to put the Canada's digital services tax in the crosshair. So that's probably dead. Plus their online streaming act as well. So yeah, there's just a lot going on. It's like it's basically like all these like stupid policies that like the Loonie Hour did our best to highlight, and we did our best to bring on smart guests that were specific to that field and that industry, that came on to the show and said, listen, this isn't going to work out how you think it's going to work out. This is a bad idea. Most of these policies, thankfully, are now unwinding.
But this is important because it relates to a specific theme that we've talked about at length, and something that I sort of, and a call I made a couple of weeks ago, which is the risk to Canada is not the tariffs. The risk to Canada is that there is like an across the board cutting of all kinds of taxes, specifically corporate taxes. So in 2017, they
You mean in the US?
Excuse me. Yes. Sorry, in the US, and how that would suck more and more capital from the world, sure, but also Canadian investors investing in the US, and how that would have knock-on effects and might destabilize financial and capital markets, and on and on and on. But anyway, so that's something that I think is really important, and we'll see more of going forward, or not. We'll see. Anyway, Keith, sorry, you want to jump in there?
No, I already did that. But I mean, I think we've been, so far this episode, we've been very clear. Hey, we've used the word pendulum a number of times. The tide has changed and all that stuff. And so what I want to introduce next is how this could change things in a different direction that not a lot of people are thinking about yet. And I know before, Rich, you mentioned we talked about something last week or the week before. We brought up the idea. Do you want to talk about that? Introduce that, and then 3 days later, somebody else commented on the same thing. Oh,
yes, of course. Right. So we were talking about how the UK is basically in trouble due to their, lack of growth, sort of poor policies with respect to energy. They have the highest energy prices in the former EU. Their tax and spend policies going back sort of on their manifesto pledges, going after farmers, et cetera, this. And then, Keith, are you familiar with a certain gentleman named Ray Dalio, who runs a plucky little shop called Bridgewater? Have you ever heard of him?
Yeah, I know Ray Dalio, of course.
Yeah, so he came out in the FT. He talks about, so Ray Dalio is, a billionaire hedge fund manager from Bridgewater Associates, which is one of the biggest, I don't know, dare I say, best hedge funds in the world. And he actually warned that the UK could be heading for what he, in quotes, a death spiral. So I would just like to welcome Ray Dalio as a new listener of the Loonie Hour.
Get him on the Loonie Hour.
Yeah, we should try to get him on the Loonie Hour. But I mean, all jokes aside, I think it's something that you highlighted, Keith. So it's nice to see that we're in good company, or you're in good company anyway.
Yeah, so specifically what the comment with the UK was that it's going to be very difficult for them to improve their deficit. The debt they have outstanding has a longer duration or maturity structure or average relative to Canada and elsewhere. But plus the liquidity, the amount of UK bonds or gilts they call them that trades is quite low. And that sets them up to potentially have a severe crisis in their bond market. And that's exactly what Dalio came out with, like literally 3 or 4 or 5 days after we did. So, Loonie Hour ahead of the game. So now we're going to talk about the next thing he will be talking about after he watches this show. And because of, Steve, you introduced this just a few moments ago, there's more of a nationalistic approach, and that's not good or bad. It is what it is. People start looking after themselves. The Americans will start cutting taxes, taking capital elsewhere. There's now a bigger focus on deficits, right? Here in Canada, especially. Now we're a little bit behind the cycle. We're going to have to wait till most likely October, or maybe it'll be a spring or summer election. We'll see. But so I think two things could potentially happen next. One is short term, and one is more longer term. The short term one, I think the probability of China devaluing their currency, it's a very real risk that everyone should have on their radar right now. And you should be prepared for it if it happens with the financial world. We already talked about China and how domestically their economy is really struggling. Talked about their, the debt challenges they have. Too much. The economy is not growing. A lot of their debt is dead. I mean, they have all this happening. One of their responses to this, because they've gone through a lot of things already. And by the way, any data that the Chinese send out, don't believe it. Like it's very difficult to figure out what's true or not. But one of the next things that they could be looking at is actually devaluing the currency. And if they do that, maybe it's a 10% or 15% or something in that range. If that happens, it's going to have an immediate deflationary effect for the US dollar world. So the Chinese currency will decline in value. The US dollar will go vertical. That's what will happen there. The Canadian dollar, euro, pound, everything else will go down relative to the US dollar, but up relative to China. So it's going to have this knock-on effect, because then anyone who is actually competing with the Chinese for manufacturing and exporting and stuff, like Japan, for example, all of a sudden they're going to be sitting there saying, oh, wow, I think we might need to devalue as well. So you're going to have all of a sudden an economic war developing from out of the blue. Everyone's thinking it's just the Americans against the Chinese, or the Americans versus Canada and Mexico and stuff. China they've been backed into the corner that they could actually just unleash this in a moment's notice. And again, the whole financial world is going to go, oh, we weren't ready for this. What happens next? That's the near term thing. I think you guys have seen that before as well.
Yep.
On your
Thank goodness for oil, right, Rich? That hard currency coming to Canada, which
Don't get me started.
our journalists deceivingly omit
Yes.
from their.
Credit to what's her name, Vassie. She's been doing a good job, I have to say. Credit
Yeah,
to
she
that
is
lady.
good. She's one of the good ones.
She's been doing a really good job. Wait a minute, I'm sure Keith wanted. What was the second thing?
Chinese. So the second one is a bit of a longer term. So if we get through this next hump, and now everyone is trying to improve their deficits. So we know with the Americans now, they have the Department of Government Efficiency is coming up. Whether how much they're able to improve the deficit or not, we know one thing is going to happen. It's going to improve, right?
You think?
So I mean,
You
so
think?
less,
I'm not as convinced. I'm not as convinced.
Loonie Hour bet.
yeah, it's going to, they're spending now. I think you have about 60, 62, 4%, something like that, of American spending. They can't touch it anyway. That will continue to do its thing. I also know that the remaining 30 plus, it's already spending is not increased as much as everywhere else, but there are some areas there for improvement that should take place. Because that's happening with the US, and if whatever happens with the Canadian political side coming up here now, I would imagine there's going to be a focus on the deficit, right?
Okay.
That's what's going to happen. No?
Well,
Yes?
yeah, no, I mean, you were just talking about deficits, and it's just amazing to see everyone now is talking about deficits, and I think the UK is that clear warning signal that okay, this is not good. It felt like what was it 3 years ago? Everyone was talking about MMT, deficits didn't matter. We basically tried it during the pandemic. And
yeah, it's a stupid idea. It was a stupid idea then. It's a stupid idea now. Anyway, sorry.
Well, it's just amazing, right? It's 3 years later, okay, we tried that. That didn't work very well. And
yeah, the lady, the MMT lady, she wrote a book. She did a few interviews.
Yeah,
she made some money.
She made her money on it, and now she's gone. But so say you have the Canadians, we go through this deficit improvement attempt, the same with the Brits, all across Europe and everywhere. And let's just say everyone, we are able to spend less than what we were originally budgeting or forecasting. Remember, the change is at the margin, right, Rich?
Mm-hmm. Margin, my favorite word.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. Diffusion is your favorite word. We'll have that. So if this is happening around the world, all of a sudden now it means there should be less borrowing by governments, or the growth in borrowing should slow. Again, change at the margin. That means there's less capital coming into the world. And that's going to be a negative for economic growth. It's going to be especially negative for the world that needs US dollars. It's one thing for the Canadians and Europe, everyone else, to borrow less. Like, no one cares, really. If the Americans start borrowing less than what the world was originally expecting, there's less US dollars going into the world. So in a way, by governments improving their fiscal position, it's actually negative for the world, and it's actually going to accelerate the debt destruction moment that's coming up.
I don't know about that.
That is, can you mute Rich, please? That that is the next discussion that's going to be coming up here. And it's something that we, again, you have to, again, we're at this, like this, the long pendulum has started to swing the other way, with terms of interest rate cycle and all that. But because, again, everyone's become so used to debt issuance by governments that the pension funds are gobbling it up, and your mutual funds and you name it, and QE and everything is going on top of it sometimes. But if that starts to slow at the margin, it's going to have huge effects somewhere in our economy. Because again, this is very different than what we've had before. This is too big of a conversation for Rich, obviously. Steve, I know
No,
you get
I
it.
just-
where
Well,
you
no,
are.
I mean, obviously, like debt issuance, though, in general in the U.S., I mean, it's projected to grow significantly over the next number of years. So, I mean, is there enough demand to absorb it at current yields? I mean, obviously, there's enough demand to buy the debt, but at current yields, I think is another debate.
But that's my point. You just said what's projected to be issued in the coming years.
Do you think it's going to go significantly lower?
If governments improve their deficits, by default, it means there's less issuance. They're borrowing less than what was expected.
But like, if you unpack that further, so what are they going to do? Like, in order to rein in that deficit, I mean, what are you going to do? You got to shrink government. You got to shrink social programs. So if you're shrinking government, obviously there's more job losses. Does that filter through into less?
EV factories, maybe things
Yeah,
like
but does that
or
fil-
you
does-
get more productive. This is the thing that, like,
yeah,
I
but
think
how
Keith
Rich?
and
How
I
quickly
always
do
fight
that?
over.
What I'm saying is, if you had this massive government debt finance spending that's taking up a larger and larger share of GDP, and then all of a sudden you cut that back, does that not also shrink at the same time, shrink tax revenues coming in?
Not necessarily, because
I don't
think
know.
that-
I'm not convinced of that deficit. Anyways,
No, but,
I guess
but that
Now,
logic.
Rich is right in that we don't know what the output will be, because if it's tax cutting, maybe there's enough economic growth created, that will create new capital coming from the equity side. But again, this is if it's just one country doing it, again, if the Canadians do it, no one cares. But the fact that the Americans have explicitly said, we're going to try to spend less than what we spent before, and they're going to cut taxes, which is going to take capital away from other countries and economies. And if they're also going to try to improve their deficit, which in Canada, it's going to be a huge political talking point in the election coming up, then it's going to create a distortion out there in the market. I mean, no one's talking about it yet, except for the battling turds.
So I agree with Keith in a sense, but I also think it's important to contextualize where the U.S. deficit is right now and why it absolutely needs to come down. And so, I'll share the chart. So right now, the U.S. unemployment rate is 4.1, and the U.S. deficit, the budget balance as a percentage of GDP, is negative 4.5. Now, obviously, let's ignore the COVID just for a second. But at one point, Joe Biden and the rest of the U.S. government was running a budget balance of nearly 8% with unemployment at 3.5%, which is wildly dislocated from sort of the last 40 or 60 years of history. Yeah, it's almost 70 years of history, which is when you have very, very low unemployment, your deficits shrink. And then when you have a crisis or a recession, you explode your deficit to manage sort of that decline in domestic demand and sort of offset any of the negatives. Right or wrong, that is exactly what has happened over the last 70 years. And so the idea that now the US is going to sort of rein in its budget deficit, in my view, is eminently natural, regardless of your political views. I think what's been going on is sort of outside any Keynesian sort of view on the world. I think, and then with respect to its knock-on effects on the rest of the world, I agree with Keith. Where I disagree with Keith is that people are just going to have to do more with less. And what does that mean? That means an increase in productivity, right? By definition. If a government spends less money and demands an increased output, you are getting more productive. And we are long overdue for increases in productivity. I've shared the chart on Twitter, and I'll talk about it now. The public sector's productivity has not increased in 20 years. That's insane.
So, Rich, you were right, except you used the wrong country as your example.
Okay.
Yeah. So if this was Canada, you're absolutely right, or any other country in the world except the US.
Okay.
So here's something else. Make another big statement, and Dalio will come out and say this again like a week after. The economic world will collapse if the Americans ran a balanced budget.
Yes, I agree. I agree with that. I agree.
The Americans, by default, by having the US dollar as reserve currency, it has to run a deficit.
Yeah.
And a trade deficit, absolutely. There's no way to balance, the twin deficits, because if they did, there is no excess US dollars swishing around the world, which means the euro dollar market just collapses, and then the banks collapse, pension funds collapse, and you name it. So this, this view that the Americans want to improve their deficit and so forth, they can do it. I think they can become more efficient, obviously, because we know, there's a lot of efficiencies. Sometimes there's some efficiency in government operations. That's a very broad statement. But I know some people say, oh, the Americans had to reduce their deficit and everything. It would absolutely collapse the economic world. And a lot of people don't understand that and appreciate it. But now you listeners, you guys know that now. This is a big episode today.
Yeah, jeez.
Huge.
So, no, just to round it out. So as of January 2025, so U.S. true interest expense is approximately 103% of tax receipts. So effectively what it means is the government's borrowing money to pay for its interest expenses.
Yeah,
So
but Keith's point is that they're the reserve currency of the world, right? Everybody uses.
Fair enough. So I mean,
and if the U.S., for example, snapped its fingers and ran a budget surplus and a trade surplus, just as an example, as an extreme example, it would suck in all of the capital that literally the 80% of the world trades.
Well, U.S. dollars.
So I got a question then. So if you're the U.S. government, what are you cutting? Because as of right now, your entitlements, defense, and interest expenses are consuming about 110% of U.S. Tax receipts.
But they just need to grow their GDP and have all of those numbers be flat for 5 years.
Right. I mean, I suppose. Yeah. I guess.
Sorry,
that's said and done.
We're getting into, of course, but we're getting in the weeds here. But these are nominal terms. These are nominal figures. So all you need to do is say,
what does this mean for Canada though? I look at it and say, okay, well, I mean, clearly you actually have to worry. We're in a time where again the pendulum has swung, and now deficits, they do matter. The budget won't balance itself, and we have to find a way to balance it. And
I see what Steve did then, Rich. Did you see what he did?
So we had a $62 billion deficit last year.
I hear it's in the 70s, to be truthful. I think
Keith, how much of that deficit and moving forward, remember we always joked about, the government has these projections where over time the deficit will magically fall and sort of balance out. And a lot of those projections, Keith, were based on the government pulling in higher tax revenues from the higher capital gains taxes. I think it was about 17 billion they had earmarked from that policy, which not only has Christopher Freeland pulled a 180 and says, I ain't doing that. I'd imagine Mark Carney is probably also going to campaign on, I ain't doing that. And Pierre Poilievre has already said he ain't doing it. So regardless of who's getting in power here,
it seems like the deficit is a lot worse than I think we're being told. And so for Canadians, this ultimately means, you're going to have to cut the public sector. There's going to have to be job losses in that space. I think
Well,
they just announced
damn
they just
right.
cut.
We're at a
And that's
30-year high. We're at a 30-year high.
Well, they
There's
just
no
cut
productivity
their
gains.
immigration program. They just laid off a couple thousand people.
so with I was very clear. We have to set the American situation to the side
Yeah.
because it's completely different no matter what people may think or what they hear or told elsewhere. The US dollar reserve currency world is completely different, and like only the Loonie Hour we understand that. That's it. The Canadian situation, um, we have an incredible opportunity to improve it. And it's not fair, people who are working in government jobs are dependent upon that system and the knock-on effects from it. As Rich has pointed out numerous times, what's the best way to change our financial situation?
Energy, oil,
I think he said productivity. Actually,
productivity.
that was,
Sorry.
yeah. So some folks are going to have some uncomfortable moments, but the opportunity is there to let's put it this way. Let's just say they didn't reduce aggregate spending. Okay, so say three of us we take over Ottawa and we were in charge of all the spending, and they say, hey, you guys can do what you want, but you're still going to have a $70 billion deficit coming up. And then we would say, okay, fine, fair enough. However, we're going to rearrange all the chairs on this deck. And just by doing that, that deficit will gradually, not very quickly, actually, when Rich gets a hold of it, the productivity will increase, and we can take care of that side of it. So it's not always just like one for one. We cut
Right.
that or cut that spending, and all these little like turning the dials. And I actually had an accountant send me a very unpleasant email a while back. And he said he cringes whenever I mention the Income Tax Act and everything.
Name
And-
drop them.
No,
Yeah, I
Call 'em
won't
out.
do that. But I checked out his background. He's like a master's in taxation and everything. And I'm like, dude, like your entire existence is based on this big pile of crap. And if you remove it, it just let the animal spirits out into our economy. So I think in Canada, it's not a 10-year plan or project to maybe improve this a little bit. It can be done extremely rapidly. But the key is with the changes, they have to be so inviting and interesting and acceptance that foreign investment is going to come in. That's the way we do it. Because right now it's not coming in.
Well, that's what I wanted to jump in and say, because like not all deficits are created equal, and people like Keith will disagree with that, but he's wrong. The reality is, if you spend a lot of your deficit on consumption, which is what we're doing right now in Canada, that's inflationary. And inflation hurts the poorest people in Canada the most. People need to get that through their head. Inflation hurts poor people. Rich people like Keith are protected because they own assets, and those assets are in real terms. If a government spends its deficit on investment, all things being equal, generally it's not as inflationary because they're creating productive assets that will last a long time and can improve the productivity of a country. And so there's like some nuance to that. I think that's really, really important that people just simply not people, I mean people in the media specifically, refuse to acknowledge. Canada is a habitual underinvestor in lots of different things, and we need to turn that around if we're going to increase our productivity.
Well, one way to do that, Rich, is to remove interprovincial trade tariffs, which we talked about on the Loonie Hour, I believe, last week. And there's news articles now circulating that all the provincial premiers are banding together and discussing and debating about how to remove these interprovincial trade tariffs. So we'll see how that shapes up.
So why weren't they discussing this before?
Why? Who knows?
Yeah, it's amazing, right? So, but like again, we talk about these are easy things to do, and some folks won't like these changes that take place. But just so the gist of it, what you just brought up or introduced again, Steve, was that it's my understanding that the tariffs or penalties or cost of trading between and amongst provinces is actually greater than what some of the suggested tariffs will be coming out of the US? Is that somewhere in that line?
Rich
You're
might know.
close.
I don't have
You're
Or
close. You're close.
It's a major.
It's very hard to
trade
calculate
barrier.
them, but broadly speaking, there's enormous interprovincial tariffs, effectively.
Well,
So if I want to try to make a bunch of cheese in Nova Scotia and bring it into Quebec to sell, I'm pretty sure that would not be
Right. Or
welcomed,
beer,
correct?
or beer, like stupid things like alcohol, wine from Vancouver. Like, it's bananas. Like, what are we doing?
Or if I
BC
brought a good
wine.
hockey team in there, I think that would be
No,
welcome.
no. Hockey is exempt, of course.
Well, I think that's I think it's a good place to wrap it up. I mean, I think there's lots going on here. Like I said, we announced it last week, but we have an interview lined up with Alberta Premier Danielle Smith. So we'll get her thoughts on tariffs. I don't know. Trump has still promised that he'll have tariffs in place by February 1st. I mean, obviously he's a fairly unpredictable human being, so we'll see if that comes to fruition or not. But I'm sure Danielle will be able to shed some light on the ins and the outs and some conversations that are happening. And yeah, I don't know. It'll be interesting. So we're looking forward to that. And it'll be released as always in the same day every Friday. But yeah, we'll see how things go. Looking forward to that. Any parting words, Boomer?
Any parting words?
Any parting
No.
words of wisdom?
No.
All right.
I have some parting words. The Canadians are going to win the Stanley Cup.
Go Habs. All right. It's a good place to wrap it up. As always, guys, appreciate the support. If you've found this episode of value or entertaining, all we ask that you share it with one friend or family member. Continue to build the Loonie Hour community. Again, obviously, the larger the community gets, the more listeners, the more downloads that we have, the better the guests we're able to bring on, such as guests like Danielle. So, as always, guys, we'll see you next week.